Maria LoBiondo, thank you so much for being with us today. Please tell us a little bit about your work and please tell us a story.
Thank you, Eric. And first, I want to say thank you to all who are here and to you for this festival. I have to say that I don't know when you sleep in the month of February, getting this all together, but I really appreciate this festival and the fact that one of the good things of the pandemic is that I've gotten to hear storytellers from all over the world, thanks to festivals like this one. Again, my name's Maria LoBiondo. I live in Princeton, New Jersey, in the United States. And well, I've been a preschool teacher, been a journalist, a little bit of a social worker. And you might say I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up until I found storytelling, which allows me to be a little kid or to be insightful or to have many, many moods through the stories that I've told for more than 20 years at festivals and classrooms, mainly classrooms, and mainly folk and fairy tales, which I like to tell in the oral tradition of sharing them and making them come alive with my listeners. So this morning for me and evening for you, I would like to share a Sicilian tale called The Thieving Dove, or La Paloma, which was collected by Giuseppe Pitre in Sicily. C'era una volta, once upon a time, there was a princess who liked to stand by her window in the morning and brush her long dark hair. La principessa, the princess, one day was standing by her open window when she noticed La Paloma, a dove. And strangely, that dove flew into her window, into her room, and snatched in its beak one of her hairpins and then flew away. Oh, she didn't know the meaning of that and then didn't think much of it. But the next day, when she was standing at her window again, brushing her hair, the dove came back, flew into her window again, and snatched her hair ribbons and flew off. Strano, strange, she said, but again didn't think much of it. On the third day, when she stood at her window brushing her long dark hair, and the dove came again, this time the dove snatched her favorite hair comb. Basta, enough, she said, and she flew down the stairs, flew out the door, and went to grab her hair comb. The dove seemed to wait for her, but as she got close enough, flew off, and she chased it. And every time she got just close enough to try and grab her hair comb, the dove flew off again. It led her down streets she had never gone down before. It led her out of the city gates, into the forest, and she kept following it until she came to a clearing where there was an old dilapidated hut, and then the dove seemed to disappear. Well, she went inside the hut expecting to find the dove, but instead there was standing a young man. Have you seen a dove with a hair comb in its beak? It's been stealing from me for 3 days. Yes, I am the dove. You are the dove? What does that mean? I am under an evil enchantment that will not let me leave this hut in human form. But you can help me. If you will sit here by this window for a year, a month, and a day, and watch as I fly off over that mountain and not leave your eyes from that place for a year, a month, and a day. Then I can stay in my human form. Will you do that for me?" Well, the princess didn't think twice. She sat right down by the window, and the young man left the hut, turned back into the dove, and flew off over the mountain. And she watched as the dove got smaller and smaller. And then she kept watching, and she did not let her eyes leave that spot where the dove disappeared. She sat there, and the sun came through the window and turned her skin to like leather. And the wind and the rain came through the window, and her long dark hair was tangled and turned into knots. And insects and animals came, and some insects made their home in her hair, and some animals made their homes in her long skirts, and her clothes turned ragged from all that weather. But she sat there, and she did not falter for a year, a month, and a day. And in that time, after that time, she saw coming toward her a form. And as it got closer, she saw it was that young man. And he came up to the window, and he looked at her, and he said, "Oh, look at you. You did all this for a man?" And he spit at her, turned, and walked away. Oh, well, she was devastated. She crawled out of the hut into the clearing and began weeping and weeping. She was laying there weeping when 3 older women came by. Now, some might have called them fate, fairies. Others might have called them strega, witches. But in any case, these 3 women, these 3 sisters, were magical beings. And seeing the young woman, they said, "What happened to you?" And she told them. And then the eldest of the sisters said, "Do not be afraid, and do not lose trust in yourself. All will be well. If you will allow us, we will help you." And with that, she touched the young woman's skin, and it turned back into its supple form. And the second sister touched her hair, and those long dark curls returned. And the third sister touched her clothes, and the rags were gone. "Now, if you will come with us, we will help you," the 3 sisters said. "We will be like your ladies in waiting." And of course, La Principessa said yes, and she went with them. And they brought her to a city where there was a big castle, and with their magic powers, the 3 sisters conjured up un palazzo, a beautiful palace right next to the castle, but more grand. And then they went inside, and the young woman had everything she could have ever wanted. The 3 sisters told her that every morning she should sit by a window that was opposite the castle. And she did. And it happened that there was a prince who lived in that castle. And one day, he looked out his window and he saw this beautiful young woman, and he had to meet her. He began sending messengers over to request a meeting. But under the advice of her ladies in waiting, the young woman refused messenger after messenger, day after day, until finally she admitted one into her presence. And she said, "If your prince is so eager to meet me, tell him to have a passageway built, a passaggio, from my window to his window. and to have it strewn with 6 inches of rose petals. Then he is to stand on his side of the passage and to not say a word. And I will cross over and we will meet. Well, hearing this, the prince did not hesitate. He called the royal carpenters, he called the royal gardeners, and the passage was built and strewn with rose petals. And on the appointed day, at the appointed time, he stood on his side, not saying a word. And with her ladies in waiting behind her, the young woman began to cross. But she hadn't gotten more than a few steps when she called out, "Oh, a thorn!" And she sunk into the rose petals, and the 3 ladies in waiting came and carried her off. Well, the prince sent messengers to find out what had happened, and it was not good news. Oh, the thorn had ripped into her foot. Her foot was infected. She had a terrible fever. The doctors feared she would not live. On and on for days, until finally, one day, he looked out his window, and there she was, fully restored, sitting there. So again, he began sending messengers over and over because he had to meet her. But again, she refused one after the other, until finally, one day, she allowed one into her presence, and she said, "If your prince is still so eager to meet me, tell him to tear down that old passageway and to build a new one. But this time, it is to be strewn with jasmine petals, and he is to stand on his side and not say a word. At the appointed time, I will cross over and we will meet." Well, hearing this, the prince again called for the royal carpenters and the royal gardeners, and the passageway was torn down, a new one was built. And at the appointed time and on the appointed day, he stood there not saying a word. And with her ladies in waiting behind her, the young woman began to cross over on this new passageway. But she hadn't gotten even halfway across when, oh, a nail! And she sunk again into the jasmine petals. And the 3 ladies in waiting came and they picked her up and they carried her off. And the prince sent messengers to find out what had happened. And the news was even more dire. Oh, the nail had ripped into her foot. And not only was her foot infected, but it was gangrenous. And the gangrene had gone up into her leg. Her leg and her foot were swelled twice their normal size. She had a terrible fever. The doctor feared not only would she never walk again, but she might not live. On and on for days and days, until finally, after a long time, the prince looked out his window, and there she was, sitting restored again. Well, by this time, the prince was wasting away. Oh, he couldn't eat. He had to meet this beautiful woman. He again sent messenger after messenger over, begging for a meeting. And again, all those messengers were refused, until one day, one was allowed to speak to the young woman. And La Principessa said, "Well, if your prince is still so eager to meet me, tell him to have his coffin built, and for him to lay down inside it, and to have his knights carry his coffin up and down the streets of this city, ending in the front of my palazzo. And then I will come out and we will meet." Well, the messenger hurried back to tell the prince what La Principessa had said. And the prince, well, he paused only for a short time, but he had his coffin built, and he lay down inside it, and he allowed his knights to raise it onto their shoulders and carry him up and down the streets of the city. And when that was done, They put it down in front of the palazzo, and the young woman came out and she looked down at the prince in his coffin, and she said to him, "You did all this for a woman?" She spit at him. This sounded a little familiar to the prince. And when he looked a little more closely, he realized who this young woman was. He climbed out of the coffin, got down on his knees, looked at her and said, "Can you ever forgive me? Can we start over?" I will leave it to you to decide what the young woman said. And as all Sicilian stories end, "I ridi restauro felice e contenti, ecco qui senza niente." And they lived happy and content. And here we are without a cent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So they did better than we did.
Well, in my research on Sicilian tales, they have several formulas actually where they end. They always bring everyone back to the real world. And in the translation in English, thanks to Jack Zipes and Joseph Russo, that is the traditional ending that was collected for that story.
Mm-hmm. Anybody, any thoughts about the story?
That was wonderful. I hadn't heard, I mean, the theme is sort of, there, but when you said he spit on her after that, that was shocking. It was like, oh my God. And then I was watching Payback, right? The Payback Karma, right? And then I thought, this is really great. And then I love that there was you decide. You decide, and then the humor about, well, and we're left without a cent. That's what a great, well-rounded and wonderful telling. You really I could see the woman there sitting and all this other stuff, like the visuals were all there. So thank you.
Thank you, Judy. And I have to tell you that in the translation that I read, of course, this is a fairy tale, and it ends, of course, with her taking him back happily ever after. But when I told it to some young women, say middle schoolers, 10, 11, 12 years old, they were outraged at the fairy tale ending and couldn't believe that she would take him back. And so I adjusted the ending.
Oh, I like the ending much better. It reminded me of a fairy tale I heard a long time ago where you didn't know whether, and not knowing makes it much stronger. And it also makes it come to have a personal truth, right? My personal truth might not be your personal truth. So some might go with him and some might not. Some might just live next door to each other. Who knows, right?
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you, Maria. That was wonderful.